first of all, welcome to Kent USA and this very special summer spotlight speaker event featuring conversation with Attorney General Josh Stein of North Carolina and Attorney General Douglas Peterson of Nebraska, moderated by former Attorney General, current gubernatorial candidate for the great state of Maryland, my birth state, Doug Gansler. Big Tent USA is a national grassroots advocacy organization that promotes a moderate political platform focusing on the rights of all Americans, civic engagement, and good governance at both the state and federal level. Founded by a group of women in 2019, Big Tent breaks through the political noise and provides substantive information, concrete action items, and innovative activism opportunities for members to make a positive difference in their communities and beyond. We are an inclusive coalition of women who value decency and effective governance, truthful and ethical leadership, equality, justice, and opportunity for all Americans. While we have taken a break this summer, we are gearing up for our fall speaker series, which will focus on what we need to know about the many threats facing our democracy, like voter suppression and election certification laws, and what we at Big Tent can do to combat these threats. We are kicking off our fall spotlight series with States United Democracy Center, which works with state officials, law enforcement leaders, and other partners to safeguard our democracy and keep our elections fair and secure. Co-founders Joanna Ludgate and our very own our very own Norm Eisen will update us on their work at States United. So please save Tuesday, September 14th for this discussion. Time will be determined later. We are thrilled to have Doug Gansler join Big Tent USA for a second spin as moderator of a spotlight call. Doug is a graduate of Yale University and UVA Law School. He has served as Assistant United States Attorney, 2-term as State's Attorney for Montgomery County in Maryland, 2 terms as Maryland Attorney General, Chair of the Democratic Attorneys General Association, President of the National Association of Attorneys General, and if that weren't enough, he is now running for governor of Maryland in next year's election. I want to remind everyone to please put your questions in the chat, and we do have a live transcript if you need it for this call at the bottom. And with that, I will let Doug Gansler take it from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kitty, and thank you, Big Tent, for doing all of these series that you've been doing. They've been fascinating, and if there were more of these kind of dialogues and conversations, the world would be a better place. Certainly our country would be, and bringing people together like General Stein and General Peterson is precisely what we want to do. They are both icons in the Attorney General world. They're both very incredibly well respected. You know, there's 56 attorneys general actually in 50 states plus DC and the territories, and Josh Stein and Doug Peterson are both just active attorneys general, both within NAG, which is the National Association of Attorneys General, and within their party's leadership as well. So it's a real honor and a privilege to have them both here. Why don't we just jump right in and go ahead and put some questions in the chat. I'm 58 years old, but I should be able to figure out how to pull those down and be able to ask questions. But when we first started, when Kitty and Susan and Emily and others wanted to do something like this, the big issue of the day was voting rights and voter suppression movements around the state and access to the ballot in other states. And so I guess, why don't we start off, if you don't mind, General Peterson, we'll start off with you from the great state of Nebraska. Just if you wouldn't mind telling everybody sort of what the role of the Attorney General, the state Attorney General is in elections, and what are your views on what's going on in Nebraska on that issue and around the country?
Thanks, Doug, and I think you look really good in a tie. That's the first time I've ever seen you in a tie, but
thanks for those.
You know, frankly, in the state of Nebraska, and I think this is true in a lot of states, the election is managed by your Secretary of State. And so our Secretary of State is primarily responsible for maintaining the both the efficiency of the election laws and also the integrity. And we really in Nebraska have not had a history of much misconduct. In fact, we briefly looked at a matter this year, and we have fairly significant laws if there is a violation of our election laws or a class 4 felony. But we've been fortunate in this state, so we've had very little history of any election fraud. You know, as the Constitution in Article 2 provides that for presidential races, all state legislators or legislative bodies are responsible for creating the presidential laws. And it's very interesting because in serving as AG, I get to meet with AGs from around the country, and every one has maybe a different challenge with regards to compliance with the law. But one of the things that bothers me probably the most in what I've seen in the last 6 months post the November election is I think the general public really struggles to receive truthful information. It's just, you know, we know in the internet world, there's certain sources. We know in the cable world, there's certain sources that are just cited one way or another. And I think people are crying out for truth. And I think citizens, I think voters really have a much more difficult job of getting to the bottom of things. So labels can be put on certain state laws or certain state changes. And I think someone who's not being diligent about it will embrace those labels and say, oh, the law must be that way. And so I think one of our challenges, if we want to be a properly operating republic, is to make sure that we maintain the integrity of our election laws. Everyone, I think, agrees to that. But really, as a citizen, what I have to do is if I'm being told that some law is obstructing people's access to vote, I can't take that at face value. I have to go and look at the language of the law, and I have to compare it against other states that are not being accused of that and say, show me in what way is there an obstruction taking place? Because you can no longer really trust the media sources as far as I'm concerned, because I've heard too many misrepresentations about what's going on. And so on a national level, I hope that we can have a better objective evaluation as to what laws truly say.
Thanks. And General Stein, if you would pontificate with your Dartmouth and Harvard law background, that'd be great.
I can also pontificate with my North Carolina experience, because
That'd be good.
we absolutely have a sordid history in terms of election access and ballot access for Black people. And it's not a history exclusively of the distant past. There was a case that was brought in federal court a couple of years ago, in fact, on an election bill that had a number of provisions. And when I had been in the state Senate, which was my job previous to Attorney General, I had mounted as vigorous an opposition to the law as I possibly could, unsuccessfully, with our Republican legislature. Well, a panel of federal appellate court judges, and these were judges that had been appointed by both Republican and Democratic presidents, unanimously concluded that that law targeted African Americans with, quote, almost surgical precision. And it was one of the first decisions I faced as the newly elected Attorney General starting my term in 2017, because the previous Republican governor, 3 days before I took office, filed a cert petition to get that reviewed by the US Supreme Court. And I made the immediate decision to withdraw that cert petition, because I don't think the state should be about trying to defend laws that have intentionally discriminated against Black people, making it harder for them to participate in our elections. So I did that. The role of Attorney General is complex because we defend state law, but we also make our legal decisions on how to defend the law. It was my decision not to seek cert on that case, to withdraw that petition, meaning review by the US Supreme Court. But then there was another case where on partisan gerrymandering, and we're one of the only state, in fact, I think we are the only state where a federal court concluded that our legislative maps constituted unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. And it was the case that went to the US Supreme Court, where the US Supreme Court ruled we're staying out of the business of adjudicating gerrymanders under the US Constitution. Well, that same map had been challenged in state court under the state constitution, and my office is forced to defend state law. But I made a personal decision to recuse myself from that defense. I had career people vigorously defend it, but I just can't, I believed it to be unconstitutional and wrong, and so I wasn't going to defend it personally. And in fact, I wrote an amicus brief on behalf of the governor. I'm allowed to actually take different positions in the same case. It's one of the peculiarities of the Office of Attorney General. And I argued that the partisan gerrymander violated the state constitution, and the court adopted that argument, struck down those maps. And so what I am gravely concerned about is that people have the access to be able to vote, that their vote be treated equally, that they're not discriminated against in terms of how much their vote is worth by a partisan gerrymander. And now what we're seeing a wave of are state laws that they're partly about voter suppression. And I hear where Doug's coming from, that they may be over characterized in that way, but they are certainly about potential election subversion. It's about taking elections administration away from secretaries of state, or in North Carolina's case, State Board of Election or county boards of elections, and giving it to the partisan legislature. And I think it's an incredibly troubling development, one which concerns me greatly for the health of our democracy.
And do you, as Attorney General, do you interact with the League of Women Voters and other nonprofit groups, or sort of common cause, or how much influence do groups like that, or Big Tent USA, for example, how much do you listen to groups like that, or concern yourselves with their views regarding voting rights issues?
I mean, we hear from every interest group, from the left to the right, on these issues. But I mean, I think what I try to do, I'm sure what Doug tries to do, is ground his decisions based on his understanding of the law and the Constitution. And that's where I strive to do, irrespective of the views of advocacy groups.
Yeah, I'd agree to that.
So I remember when we were in baby AG school, we learned a lot of things. And one of the things you learn when you become an attorney general is you're about to take over the second most important, powerful position in your state. And the second thing, one of the things you're told is, remember, you're an attorney general first, and you go home and do your state politics second. And Kitty was marveling at our banter pregame here, and you end up really becoming very close with each other. I often didn't know if the person on my right or on my left was a Democrat or Republican. I think that's becoming less so and a little bit more polarized because of groups such as DAGA and RAGA, the Democratic Attorney General Association and the Republican Attorney General Association. And at those meetings, what at least I've seen and the public has seen is the Republicans band together to write letters and to take positions on things like the Affordable Care Act, which would be seemingly a federal program. And the Democrats did the same thing under President Trump regarding immigration and other federal issues. Can you just sort of enlighten us, and I'll start with you, General Stein, regarding sort of when you make those decisions to wade into what would purportedly be federal issues in your role as the state legal officer?
I mean, the way I look at my job is to protect the people of our state, keep them safe from whatever harms them. Now, after a storm in southeastern North Carolina, it may be price gougers coming in to exploit people whose homes have been devastated. And when I see that, I will aggressively enforce the law against them. It may be an e-cigarette company that has played a role in addicting tens of thousands of North Carolina teenagers to their product. And I take them to court and hold them accountable for hurting North Carolina teenagers. It may be pharmaceutical companies that are causing problems all across the country, and working on holding them accountable for the death and devastation they've left in their wake. Doug and I have been closely allied and working well on the Google antitrust cases. He and I are both on the executive committee. He's leading that, doing a tremendous job. And so those are all matters where my people are being hurt, and I will go to bat to protect them. Now, if the federal government takes action that is going to dirty people's drinking water, if the federal government's going to take action that is going to eliminate people's health care, then I'm going to go to court on that too. So I don't care who wrongs the people of North Carolina. That's my standard, is have you done something unlawfully that hurts North Carolinians? And whoever you are, big, small, government, non-government, I'm going to do something.
General Peterson?
Yeah, what I would say is there's kind of two forms. The one form is the consumer protection area. And Josh and I have worked together on a lot of projects there. And we work really well together because we have a unified interest in protecting our citizens. We identify through an investigation or a subsequent lawsuit bad actors that are impacting across the board. So those are really easy. They're not partisan. I've never in the almost 7 years in office seen those get too divisive. Now, it may get a little divisive when it's time to allocate portions to a settlement to states, then you have some good wrestling matches, but that's one area and we get along well. Where we get divided, and it's not really divided, but I know that Josh is going to take some positions from his perspective with other Democrat AGs who join him. And Josh understands that I'm going to do the same with some Republican AGs. So for example, among the Republican AGs, kind of a common theme is state rights. And I'll go back to the Obama administration when they tried to waters of the US. They tried to expand the authority of the EPA as to jurisdiction on waters. Now that would have a big impact on the ag community. And
now we're just going to do a little stretch on the neck.
Yeah, it's really gentle, but yeah.
So, someone I think's off mute. Go ahead.
And so what that affects us, because frankly, the original act was very deferential towards the states. The federal law was very deferential to working with the states and the states' stewardship responsibility for our environment and our rivers. And so we challenged that because basically, collectively, we felt, hey, we argue for state rights. There's no showing that we're not being good stewards of protecting the rivers. And so therefore, we think you're expanding beyond the original intent of the law. It's just going to happen. And the fact that Josh doesn't call him and say, Doug, I'm with you on that. I'd like to join in the letter. I didn't expect him to. And so we get that in our relationship. And but that is why I give that waters of the US case as an example where we thought federal authority was attempting to expand their jurisdiction at the cost of state authority. And so we engage in that process.
So that's something that sometimes pulls the Attorney General apart, some of these amicus things or letters to Congress or letters to federal agencies or letters to the president. One of the most cohesive aspect of attorneys general is that every attorney general has a consumer protection division. And you both touched on sort of protecting your consumers, protecting the people in your state. You know, the attorney general basically got on the modern map in 1997 with the master settlement agreement regarding tobacco and cigarette smoking. And that's continued today into some areas, opioids, youth vaping, Juul, and actually the cigarette cases continue as well. General Peterson, why don't, if you would sort of focus on what's been going on in the opioid space, that would be great. And then General Stein, maybe you could focus a little bit on the Juul, the Juul case and some of the vaping that we've all seen with kids in high school and college.
You know, Doug, actually, Josh was a significant leader in the opioids, so I'm going to defer to him. But before I do that, one of the things I would mention is that there has been, in my experience in office, there's been some significant unity. As you said, the big tobacco case was a good model. And opioids, frankly, in the last 7 years has been the most significant one that I think we've all worked together on. And it brought up a real significant issue, and that is who's best to represent the interest of the state citizens in such a multi-state, because there are a lot of private firms that were going into states and saying, hey, we'd like to represent your county or represent your city. And we never, as AGs, had never seen that to that extent. Frankly, it complicated things quite a bit. And it doesn't fit the model that we think AGs working in the area of consumer protection are best equipped to do. But it is very much a unifying element among the AGs when we can work together. We're doing work now with regards to social media, and also the lawsuits have been filed against Google on some and Facebook on antitrust issues. So I just want to affirm that you're right, that the consumer protection work is one in which it has great bipartisan support. But I'm going to defer and let Josh explain a little bit on the opioids and Jewel, because he was a leader in both those cases.
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, a mutual very good friend of ours, one of the favorite AGs of everybody, is the Tennessee Attorney General Herbert Slattery, who's a Republican, and he and I co-chair NAG's Consumer Protection Committee, and we were the two captain states for what was really a large group of states, bipartisan, that hammered out the big opioid case that was announced last week. And it's a $26 billion case, $21 billion from the 3 drug distributors, $5 billion from Johnson & Johnson. That comes on the heels of other cases that we've resolved. One's in bankruptcy, actually 2 in bankruptcy, Mallinckrodt and Purdue Pharma, the Sackler case, probably the most infamous of the cases. And we had another case against McKinsey Consulting, which had advised Purdue Pharma on how to turbocharge the sales of these highly addictive drugs. And when you put all that together, it's about $33 billion that we are returning to states and local governments in order to attack this crisis that is not only continued to exist through COVID, it has dramatically worsened because of COVID, because of the job loss, anxiety, depression, all of those factors which drive addiction that came out of COVID has created an incredible spike in opioid overdose deaths, tragically. So this effort to hold the drug companies accountable is the second largest state attorney general effort in history, second to the tobacco cases that Doug alluded to earlier from about 23 years ago. So what's good about this, what's different about this case, is that we have put explicit requirements that the monies that come back to states go to address the crisis, for treatment, for recovery, for harm reduction, all of these things which are evidence-based to save lives. The monies have to go to that purpose, because sadly, like in North Carolina, not a dollar of that tobacco money, we still get $140 million a year. Not a dollar of it goes to tobacco. It goes to just into the general fund and is spent like any other source of revenue. So we wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. I'd say a second complicating factor to this deal as compared to the tobacco deal is not only were you dealing with all 50 states in the district like you were in tobacco and in industry, but there were 3,000 local jurisdictions, cities and counties around the country that also sued, and they were represented by private lawyers whose interests were aligned but not exactly the same as the states. And that added an entire layer of complexity that has really, it dragged it out for the couple years we had to, it took to finalize the deal. So we're really proud of this opportunity. It's not done yet because states are in the process. They have another 3 weeks to review the deal, to sign up. Obviously, I'm signing up, having helped to negotiate it. And when a critical mass of states have joined, then the next is signing up all the local governments. And again, there needs to be a critical mass of local governments for the distributors to go forward with the deal. And I'm optimistic that all of that will happen and that we can start getting money starting next April. And then again in July, that will start pouring into towns and cities and counties where they can save where it can save lives.
So you both have touched on big tech, so we might as well go there. You just got appropriately crushed on the ridiculous Facebook lawsuit that you guys brought. And I guess I'd start with, and you're going after big tech in terms of Facebook, Google, Amazon, and the other one I'm forgetting, but there's two different issues there, I guess I'd ask. One is when you're going after opioids and tobacco and Juul and vaping, you're going after, sort of seemingly bad companies and bad products. When you go after Facebook or Amazon or Google, it's very difficult we just came out of a pandemic. Let's just take Amazon for a second. To go after Amazon for whatever reason, it's like you're fighting the court of public opinion who loves these products. 3 billion people are on Facebook. People Google multiple times a day to find out information. Is that a factor in your decision? The fact that these are companies that people like and sort of you're taking on companies that are very popular. And B, does it matter that you bring a case which clearly the Facebook case was clearly ridiculous from its inception? Why would you think about that, or you just bring it to make a point? And what is the point?
Doug, do you need to disclose any client representation?
I don't represent anybody in it. I just know that to go after an antitrust case, it would have to argue that when 10 years ago they took over WhatsApp and whatever years ago they took over the Instagram, to come back 10 years later and say, oh, they did a great job, so therefore you violated the law, that would upset American business and startup companies and entrepreneurship. And plus, and when you bring an antitrust case, the reason why you bring it is because the price to the consumer goes up, and clearly that doesn't happen when the product is free. But I guess we can talk about that offline, but I have no disclosures necessary. But go ahead.
Well, I'll let Doug go first on this because he's been a great leader on the Google matter.
Doug, education is an important thing. So you and I are going to have some time. Now, I'm not going to talk about a specific company, but what I want to talk about is consumer awareness, because the general notions are that, thank you, that all is good. And I'm going to do a plug here. Fascinating book. For me, I like books with large print and many pictures. And that's not this book, but it's The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. And it's by a professor at, I believe she's at Yale or Harvard. I may have offended her by not getting the school right. I apologize, but it's Shoshana Zuboff, and it's a fascinating book. And where on the surface, we love convenience. We love so much of what tech has to offer. But I think it's really, really important that citizens understand what the business model looks like. The business model and where the capital is, and this all occurred in the early 2000s. Google, its two founders, had written a paper in '98 talking about the purity of their search product and how they didn't want to compromise the quality and purity of a fantastic search product that had been developed. The quality of what they put together as students out at Stanford is amazing. And so popular that it became, Google was the go-to for every type of search you did. What happened is initially they did not want to monetize it. They wanted to be based upon the purity of a good search product. But frankly, when you try to go to make this a product worthy of commercial use, there's going to be always constant pressure to monetize. So what the business model turned into is a business model that gathers as much data from its users as possible. And it takes that data and then monetizes it. And that's, look at Alphabet's climb as in the search advertising area or in advertising, because they've mastered this. So when you talk about, gee, they're great companies, we're all happy and no one has a concern, people should be very aware of how it's being monetized and the impact it has on their privacy. It used to be companies, in private sector, we had a client that was in the grocery store business. When they thought about locating a grocery store, they would have a company come in and do analysis. And it was all external analysis. They would go and look and do a 1 mile, 2 mile, 3 mile radius around a proposed grocery store site. And they would know the average household income, the average vehicle value, number of children in the home. They would do all kinds of data. And then based upon that, this company would decide whether or not it matched its model for an appropriate grocery store to be located there. That's all external data that they can get from public records. What has changed now is they're now inside the house. They've now come inside the house, and it's because of this. It's because of this phone, because they will tap into emails. They will tap into your purchases. They will, if you have the sound devices, they have the ability to listen. They have the ability through the Internet of Things to know when your refrigerator is opened, with the different listening devices and measurement devices in so many of your pieces of equipment. I even have, strange story, the FTC was coming to Omaha, and they're doing hearings in different locations across the country about concerns about big tech. And one of the things that I had studied and found very interesting was this concept of the Internet of Things, where so many devices were now recording data because data had value to be transferred, to be monetized. And I read an article of this doll that had a recording device inside the doll. So I went and bought the doll. It was about 1.5 feet in height, blonde-haired doll. And I thought I would bring it because it's frankly pretty creepy that a child would be playing in a room and this is recording data, gathering data. And I just couldn't get myself to walk from my truck into the hearing room with this doll without feeling a little bit self-conscious and sitting there in the hearing holding this blonde doll. So I didn't use it as a visual, but I think it's important to understand that they're gathering data, they can sell the data, and the other thing is they can use the data to feed or manipulate what you look at on these computers. And if I can give just a brief example, MIT did an evaluation of what Facebook was doing. And with machine learning, everything about machine learning and artificial intelligence is feeding data. And based upon that, it has the capabilities to analyze patterns and habits and predict behavior. And so in this particular MIT case article, they were talking to some engineers working for Facebook. And one of the things that they could see is one particular user that they were just monitoring. They could see that I think she was a 15-year-old girl, and she was on her communications on the web, was showing that she was somewhat melancholy and possibly susceptible to depression. The engineer recommended at the time that they can tweak the analogs to steer her out of that, to steer her away from that. The problem is, if you do that, what do you compromise? Length of engagement. And that's not good for the business model. So what do? He raises this as an ethical engineer. He says, I got concerned we could actually affect the analogs to stop this behavior. But that's not what the business model calls for. It calls for further deepening into these issues. So she starts seeing articles on cutting, on bulimia, and drives her down a darker and darker channel. Now, I find that pretty offensive that any company would take advantage of the mental state of a 15-year-old girl in order to increase engagement. But they actually have financial incentives given to the engineers who can enhance engagement. So we are the tool. I mean, we are utilized. We become the product. And that product is to gather as much personal information as they can, to monetize it. And not only that, but to influence our sources of information and how we might think. And they fully understand that you feed kind of our worst instincts. And so that's why you see people going into silos on political issues, people going into certain information silos on a variety of different world issues. And then we wonder, how do they get so isolated and how do they get so separated? This came up, The Social Dilemma, which is a documentary that maybe a lot of people have seen, shows a little bit of that manipulation. And for any of the listeners who have young people or young children or grandchildren, I'd really encourage you to go watch a video called Childhood 2.0, because in that video, it shows the impact that this is having on our young people and their mental state. And it's really quite concerning that so many kids now spend 4 to 6 hours here looking for affirmation or community instead of being up and out involved in other things. And so I think when you say big tech and everything's good and they're nice companies and they're easy to buy from, I wish it was that benign, but I think we as attorney generals have a responsibility to look to the possible harms that are being caused for corporate profit. And that's why we're engaged in that process.
Thank you, General. And General Stein, before you answer, if you wouldn't mind baking into your answer a little bit of what General Peterson said, I'm going to answer Jeanette's question for her so we don't run out of time. Yes, attorneys general are on the forefront when companies are hacked, when there's hackers and personal information, health information is compromised. And I guess that the question is a little bit on General Peterson's comment is the big tech, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, they're never really accused of compromising people's PII or PHI, personal information or personal health information, banking records, social security numbers. The privacy concern is that that these companies use their information that they gather and then send them relevant advertisements to them, or that they may or may not believe are relevant or be effective. And is that the issue with privacy, or is it something else?
It's both. I mean, correct. The privacy issue where they have all of this information about us and then they exploit it to our detriment is one factor that plays into our consideration of our consumers harmed by their actions. But there's also been just security breaches where they, through their inadequate security measures, have allowed people's PII, personal identifying information, to be compromised. Remember the whole Cambridge Analytica thing? That was Facebook, right? Like they allowed millions of people's information to be compromised in a way that the users had no expectation of that occurring to outside entities, not just for their own advantage. So I mentioned earlier that my job is to make sure that people in North Carolina are protected. So if it's a towing company that's abusing people and engage in predatory towing practices, I will go after them for violating the law. But if it's the largest company in the world that's doing it, I will do the same thing. And one case we just brought against Google has to do with people who have Android operating systems on their phone. So if you're a non-Apple phone, regardless of your manufacturer, it's a Google operating system. And on that Google operating system, there's the Google Play Store from which you would then download apps. And more than 90% of all apps on Google phones use the Google Play Store. Well, the Google Play Store then forces you to use their Google payment system. And they charge you a 30% processing fee, when a credit card processing fee is usually 1%, 2%, or 3%. And that's just a perfect example of a monopoly exercising its monopoly power to tie a product or service, which is to our detriment. We're paying more money than we otherwise would. But a lot of these harms aren't, Doug asserted earlier that harm is only an increased cost. And there's some debate among antitrust scholars whether that's accurate. Some courts have held that, but there are other forms of consumer harm, like compromised privacy or the lack of technological innovation that has occurred because of these monopolies crushing out small competitors. And these are things that hurt consumers in North Carolina, but hurt people across the country. And that's why we're investigating and pursuing these cases against big tech. I mean, we're not asking ourselves what's the most popular, what's the most unpopular company. We're asking ourselves what hurts our people and what actions are unlawful in doing so. And that's why we're pursuing the matter.
One more question on that big tech issue, and then move into the last question, and I'm going to warn you both, you don't have to answer it, but there's a lot of questions regarding General Paxton's lawsuit with other states and election integrity. But in terms of the big tech, while you're thinking about that, what role, if any, do you have on sort of dealing with the tension between big tech being a platform for information being shared as a First Amendment, and you could talk about election integrity issues on that or COVID issues on that, versus the spread of false information on big tech, and what role do the state attorneys general have on that? And if you, I think this crowd would be particularly interested in how information regarding elections that is clearly false, and even political statements are clearly false. Do the AGs have a role in that, and should regulators have a role in maintaining that? And I guess we'll start with General Stein, because I think we started with Peterson last.
I think it's appropriate for Facebook and Twitter to police their platforms for misinformation, because misinformation can be incredibly damaging. It can kill people if the wrong information's out there, and telling people to take hydrochloroquine or not get vaccinated. These are things that are directly related to people dying. And, if you're a store, a brick and mortar store, and you've got some bulletin board where people can post notices about, help wanted or babysitting services, and somebody puts some anti-Semitic or racist thing on there, I think you have a moral duty to take that down. And so I think Facebook and Twitter and Google and YouTube have a moral duty to not spread hate. That's my view.
Oh, Peterson?
Yeah, a lot of this is contained in the debate on Section 230 of the CDA federal law, and that was passed back in like 97, I believe. And the Section 230 was basically saying, look, these platforms are really pipelines, and information, they provide the pipeline to get the information from the original source to the receiver, and the pipeline shouldn't be held liable. What started happening is, if you use the pipeline analogy, there was a question of whether or not the pipeline provider or the platform was going to the front of the pipeline and making determinations as to what went in and what went out. And if that's the case, are they entitled to this Section 230 protection? And so Congress has done a lot. I know Congressman Cicilline for the Democratic Party on this antitrust, and also Congressman Buck from Colorado have co-chaired and done a lot of work in that area. I think that Section 230 issue is going to have to be addressed at the federal level, since that's where the protection came from. And we in the state can't do, at the AG level, cannot do a lot about that. So the other thing I would say is what has allowed Democrats and Republicans to come together on a lot of the big tech issues so well is, and Phil Weiser, the AG from Colorado, is also one that, and Tish James, the Attorney General from New York, have been some that we've worked very closely together on these issues. And one of the things I appreciate about all of the AGs, AG Slatery from Tennessee, is we've kept focused on the technology harms and issues, and we've not allowed it to go to political speech. We've not allowed it to go to more of those divisive issues. We've kept it focused on technology. And that's why Josh and I can look at each other on the screen and smile and say, how you doing, buddy?
I agree with that Doug said. I mean, the antitrust issues, I think, are different from these other issues about what's being posted on the information. And so we focus on where we have legal authority and where it's antitrust, consumer harm, and not more ideological partisan issues.
So we banged up against the end of time, but we're going to go extend like they do in those soccer games that are 0-0 and they keep going until somebody finally scores. We'll go with one more question. General Peterson, I'll make it a two-part question so you can avoid answering the first part. There's a lot of interest in the chat room and on my text here to ask about General Paxton's lawsuit and election integrity in other states and your role in that. That's part one. You can feel free to ponder that and pontificate upon that, and gerrymandering, as gerrymandering is about to happen, as the new census is going to come in and the new districts are drawn, will there be enough time to litigate prior to the elections, the new districts? And what role do you have as state attorneys general in that? And I just want to personally thank both of you for joining us tonight. And go ahead and answer. I guess start with General Peterson.
Yeah, real quickly on the census issues. I don't think we have the census data yet. It's to go to the Secretary of State. And I think there will be some real pressure with regards to time. You know, historically, it's always been, and every state's different. In Nebraska, you know, we have a unicameral. It's supposed to be a nonpartisan unicameral. The reality is it certainly is partisan, and they have a committee to work together to come up with a plan on that. There's no question that it has political influence to it. Actually, our engagement in that is very, very limited. So that I can't speak a lot to. But with regards to the Texas case, let me talk about that. First, let me identify what the legal issue would be. And what was suggested by the Texas complaint is, as we talked earlier in the Constitution, with presidential elections, in Article 2, it talks about state legislatures are responsible for defining the laws. And so what happened is the question became, are there other branches of government? The executive branch in Pennsylvania, the question was it the judiciary, when the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania expanded the time periods, I think, for mail-in ballots and things of that nature. We did not join the Texas lawsuit. What we did do is we joined an amicus brief. And what the amicus brief was about was the amicus. It's been a while since the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled, given rulings under the election clause. And we basically submitted a brief that says to the U.S. Supreme Court, if you take original jurisdiction of this lawsuit, there are important election laws that have, or decisions that have been ruled on over the years, and we need further clarity. And the clarity, particularly in the areas of the separation of powers. And so, frankly, I've never seen a case that, and frankly, it doesn't surprise me that the viewers are very interested in this issue, because I've never in my 7 years seen an issue that generated so much emotion. I didn't join the Texas lawsuit because I didn't have sufficient information to support the factual allegations. But I did believe that the legal principles needed to be, if decided by the court, needed to be clarified. And so that's why I joined the amicus brief. But I've never seen such emotional anger expressed. And I get that. I mean, there's no question that this last presidential election had a lot of emotion, and that January 6th was an ugly example of how deep those emotions were. But, you know, I personally had some, probably the most attacking personal comments ever made to me in public by numerous people, because I joined an amicus that wanted to have clarity on constitutional election law issues. That comes with the office. I'm not complaining about that, but what I'm saying is this issue was highly, I'm losing words, but it was just a very, very difficult thing. And I had a heck of a time, and I wasn't successful trying to explain the difference between what an amicus brief is and what joining a lawsuit is. And to this day, I would say most Nebraskans think I probably joined the lawsuit, which I didn't. But
I was outraged and angered at a profound level at what General Paxton tried to do. The relief he sought was to essentially throw out 20 million Americans' votes because he didn't like how those votes were cast, and to essentially give the election to the losing candidate. And that is so fundamentally un-American. It almost shocks me that I have to say those words. I mean, this democracy is the oldest sustained democracy in the history of this country. And 25 separate times, one party has switched over the president to another party. And there was never an attempt to steal the election like this. And there certainly was never a violent overthrow. And I put this violent overthrow in part on this lawsuit being one of the bricks in the wall that led to the outrage of January 6th. I mean, I think the president was far and away the one most culpable, but General Paxton's lawsuit was outrageous. And I'm still kind of angry. And Doug and I respect the hell out of each other, and we work together extremely well, and we respect the law. And so we focus on the issues where we can work together. But I am to this day stunned that General Paxton did that. Incredibly disappointed. And so I filed an amicus brief pointing out how outrageous and unprecedented his election grasp was. And the court, as you all well know, threw it out. And so thank goodness for that. On gerrymandering, the clock is going to be tight because the census was delayed because last administration didn't get their act together on doing the census, and COVID complicated things immensely. So there's going to be a compressed schedule by which legislatures in states where the legislature draws the maps, or independent commissions in states where independent commissions draw the map. So it's going to be a tight schedule for those maps to be reviewed. The role of the Attorney General is to defend state law. And so I explained, for those of you who may have come on late, in the last round of redistricting, North Carolina, my office defended the law, defended the maps, but then I also filed an amicus brief on behalf of the governor, who argued that there was violative of state constitution. I have no idea what the legislature is going to do this time because they haven't done it yet, because they haven't gotten the census data yet. So we just have to wait and see and hope that the Constitution are followed in whatever state it is. As I told you, the federal government, the U.S. Supreme Court's essentially given a green light for partisan gerrymandering with its last decision in 2018.
Kitty?
Well, I just want to say, first of all, that this was a really interesting and very timely conversation for Big Tent. And I also just want to personally thank both Josh and Doug Peterson for coming together and showing us what, cross-partisanship, bipartisanship looks like, and how, despite the times we live in, and AG Peterson, I'm really sorry that you went through what you went through. That sounds incredibly disturbing and troubling. But I think we all really need to hear conversations like this one and hear the work that the AGs across the aisle are doing together. It's a great example of what our democracy can look like when we do come together. So I personally want to thank you for having this important conversation with us. And I want to thank your staffs, because I know how busy you are. And I want to thank Doug Gansler, who did this for us despite running for governor of Maryland. That says a lot. And while we were having this great conversation, Big Tent added another event. So I do hope that you'll check out our website, read our newsletter, follow us on social media at Big Tent USA. And in addition to our Tuesday, September 14th call with States United Democracy, we are also having Bill Crystal and Sarah Longwell join us on September 28th at 7 p.m. And so they'll be looking at the Republican Accountability Project. So again, on behalf of Big Tent USA, thank you so much to the Attorneys General, Josh Stein and Doug Peterson. We wish you well, and stay well, stay healthy. And Doug Gansler, thanks again for being moderator in chief.
Thanks.
Well,
Thanks, everyone.
everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bye.
Doug. Thank you, Doug.
See you, Josh. See you, Doug. See you, Kitty.